They were meant to be fortresses on tracks, iron beasts that could crush anything in their path. But inside, for the crews who rode them, tanks were often less a shield and more a death sentence. To many World War II soldiers, their ride wasn't called a tank. It was called a coffin on wheels. Imagine climbing into 30 tons of steel, the doors sealing shut behind you. The air is already thick with the smell of oil, sweat, and gunpowder. Every sound outside is muffled until the first enemy shell slams into the armor with a metallic scream. For the tank crew, this wasn't just a machine. It was a tomb waiting to be sealed. World War II tankers lived in a paradox. The vehicles they operated were built to protect them, but in reality, they often turned into death traps. Soldiers across every army whispered grim nicknames about their machines. American Shermans were called Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter that always lit on the first try. German panzers, though feared for their firepower, still brewed up when Allied shells hit their weak spots, and Soviet crews often referred to their tanks simply as steel coffins. The nickname wasn't exaggeration, it was bitter truth. A tank's greatest strength, its armored hull, could instantly become its greatest weakness. Once a shell punched through, escape routes shrank to a handful of small hatches, often jammed by the impact. Fire and toxic smoke spread within seconds, suffocating crews before they could even react. Ammunition and fuel stored inside that steel shell turned it into a rolling powder keg. To climb into a tank was to gamble with your life. Protected one moment, consumed the next. This opening scene wasn't just the nightmare of a few unlucky crews. It was the lived experience of tankers on every front of World War II. The men inside these machines carried not just weapons, but also the knowledge that their armored sanctuary could, at any moment, transform into a fiery coffin on wheels. On the battlefield, tanks were hailed as saviors. Infantrymen followed closely behind them, grateful for the cover their armor provided. Against small arms fire, mortars, or artillery fragments, tanks could mean the difference between life and death. To soldiers pinned down by machine guns or fortified positions, the roar of a friendly tank rolling forward felt like salvation. Its cannon and machine guns could blast through obstacles and silence nests of resistance. Tanks gave ordinary soldiers hope. But inside the armored beasts, the story was far more complicated. The very protection that saved infantry left tank crews vulnerable in a different way. They were sealed in. Escape hatches were narrow, awkwardly placed, and often blocked once shells struck. Flames, shrapnel, or even a jammed latch could trap 5 men in a burning inferno. Veterans spoke of hearing the hammering of enemy fire outside, knowing that one lucky hit would turn the whole tank into a crematorium. Crews lived with this dual reality, heroes on the outside, doomed prisoners on the inside. They carried the bitter knowledge that their vehicle was both their shield and their coffin. In letters home, some tankers joked darkly about their odds. Better pray the shell doesn't find you, because if it does, you won't have time to pray again. For the infantry, the tank was salvation. For the crew, it was survival on borrowed time. That contrast, lifesaver or steel coffin, defined the psychology of every man who climbed into an armored vehicle during the Second World War. If the tank's armor was its first curse, its fuel was the second. In World War II, many tanks were powered by gasoline engines, fast, powerful, and easy to maintain, but incredibly dangerous in combat. Gasoline fumes lingered inside the hull, invisible and waiting. When a shell pierced the armor, those fumes often ignited instantly, engulfing the crew in a storm of fire. The American Sherman was the most infamous example. Its gasoline engine earned it cruel nicknames from friend and foe alike. To Germans, it was the Tommy Cooker, a British soldier's stove that always lit. British crews called it the Ronson, after the lighter that, as advertisements bragged, lights every time. Tankers themselves often said the Sherman was more dangerous to its crew than to the enemy. Diesel-powered tanks, like the Soviet T-34, were somewhat safer, as diesel is harder to ignite. But even these were no guarantee. A direct hit could rupture fuel lines, spraying liquid fire across the crew compartment. Survivors described the terrifying sound of fuel spraying like a hose before the inevitable flash and roar of ignition. The crew had seconds, sometimes less, to escape. Inside a gasoline-powered tank, men lived with the constant fear of fire. They knew that one lucky enemy hit could turn their armored sanctuary into a furnace. It wasn't just the enemy they feared. It was the volatile fuel sloshing right beneath their feet. As if fire weren't enough, tanks carried another deadly risk, their own ammunition. Each tank held dozens of shells for its main gun, along with thousands of rounds for machine guns. This meant every tank was essentially a rolling bomb. If enemy fire ignited the ammo storage, the results were catastrophic. Crews called it the jack-in-the-box effect. When the ammunition detonated, the pressure often blew the turret clean off the tank. Eyewitnesses described turrets weighing several tons being launched into the air like toys. Inside, there was no chance of survival, only fire, smoke, and a violent end. Survivors recalled horrifying chain reactions. One shell would ignite, then the rest would follow in a thunderous explosion. A tank could vanish in seconds, replaced by a pillar of smoke and fire. Entire crews disappeared in an instant, leaving nothing but twisted steel behind. American Shermans and Soviet Lend-Lease tanks were particularly vulnerable. Ammunition was often stored in the hull without protection, waiting for disaster. Only later in the war did innovations like wet stowage, where shells were surrounded by water jackets to prevent ignition, help reduce the danger. But for most of the war, tank crews knew they were sitting on a powder keg. For soldiers outside the tank, the sight of one exploding in a jack-in-the-box effect was unforgettable. It was a brutal reminder of just how fragile these giants of steel could be once enemy fire found its mark. For the men inside, the knowledge of that possibility haunted every second they spent in combat. For American crews, the Sherman tank was both a blessing and a curse. On paper, it was one of the most versatile machines of the war, reliable, easy to maintain, and built in staggering numbers. Over 49,000 rolled off assembly lines, ensuring U.S. forces always had tanks available to keep the pressure on Germany and Japan. But for the men inside, survival was far from guaranteed. The Sherman's armor was enough to deflect small arms fire and lighter anti-tank weapons. But when it faced German 88mm guns, Panthers or Tigers, disaster struck. Veterans described watching a single round from a German tank or anti-tank gun slice through a Sherman like it was tin foil. Within seconds, flames erupted, giving crews barely enough time to scramble through hatches before being consumed. Casualties mounted at an alarming rate. Entire armored divisions reported losing multiple times their original tank strength during prolonged campaigns, with fresh Shermans and green crews constantly replacing those destroyed. German troops mocked them with cruel nicknames, but for American tankers, the humor was bitter because they knew it was true. To their credit, engineers worked quickly to adapt. Later, Shermans introduced wet stowage surrounding ammunition with water jackets to reduce the risk of detonation. This innovation significantly improved survival rates, but by then, countless crews had already paid the price. Despite their flaws, Sherman crews pressed on, relying on numbers, speed, and coordination with infantry and artillery to win the day. But ask any veteran who sat inside one under fire, and they'll tell you the same. The fear of burning alive never left them. For many, climbing into a Sherman wasn't just duty, it was gambling with fate. If American tankers thought they had it bad, Soviet crews knew an even harsher reality. On the Eastern Front, the life expectancy of a tanker was measured in days, or sometimes in minutes. The early war Soviet light tanks, like the BT-7 and T-26, were so lightly armored they might as well have been coffins on tracks. German shells tore through them with ease, leaving crews little chance of survival. Even the famed T-34, hailed as a revolutionary design, was not immune. Its sloped armor and diesel engine made it far safer than many Western counterparts, but the Germans quickly adapted with upgraded weapons like the Panther's high-velocity 75mm and the Tiger's devastating 88mm. When those shells struck, T-34s brewed up just like Shermans, trapping men inside a fiery cage. The situation was made worse by the sheer scale of Soviet losses. In the early months of Operation Barbarossa alone, thousands of tanks were destroyed. The Red Army churned out replacements as quickly as possible, but many of the crews were barely trained. Veterans recalled watching terrified young tankers climb into their machines, knowing full well they wouldn't last a week in combat. Lend-Lease tanks from the U.S. didn't fare much better. The M3 Lee, with its tall profile and cramped interior, earned the grim Soviet nickname Coffin for 7 brothers. A single hit often meant death for the entire crew, who had little room to escape the flames. Still, Soviet tankers kept fighting. Their courage and sacrifice helped turn the tide at battles like Kursk, where armored clashes reached apocalyptic proportions. But behind the propaganda of Soviet steel stood the bitter truth. For many, their tanks were just rolling graves. Across North Africa and Europe, British and Commonwealth crews faced the same grim reality. Their tanks could protect them, but only up to a point. In the desert campaigns, British cruiser tanks were fast, but thin-skinned. Against the German 88s and Panzer IVs, they burned with frightening regularity. Veterans remembered the sands of El Alamein, littered with blackened hulks, grim memorials to crews who never escaped. When Britain adopted the American Sherman, things improved, but only slightly. British crews quickly learned the same cruel lesson as their American counterparts. The Sherman Firefly, equipped with the powerful 17-pounder gun, finally gave them a weapon capable of fighting Tigers and Panthers on equal terms. But while its firepower was formidable, its armor was still vulnerable. A Firefly could kill a Tiger, but it could also be killed just as easily. Tankers developed dark humor to cope. They joked that climbing into a Sherman was like sitting inside a lighter, waiting for the spark. One British veteran described seeing his comrades dragged from burning wrecks, their uniforms still smoldering. Others recalled the desperate scramble to open hatches, while ammunition cooked off inside. Shells detonating one after another like fireworks in hell. Yet, despite these horrors, morale endured. Commonwealth crews earned reputations for discipline, courage, and sheer grit under fire. They knew the odds, but they climbed into their tanks anyway because someone had to. For every burned-out hulk on the battlefield, another crew rolled forward, ready to risk becoming the next. It's easy to think of German tanks like the Panther and the Tiger as invincible, but the truth was far darker. For all their terrifying firepower and thick armor, German crews lived with the same fear as their enemies. Once a round penetrated, their steel fortress became a death trap. Even the mighty Tiger, the symbol of Nazi armored dominance, could brew up under the right circumstances. The Eastern Front told the story best. Soviet anti-tank guns, new designs like the Su-85 and Su-100, and swarms of T-34s armed with upgraded weapons could set even a Tiger ablaze. At Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, Panthers entered combat in large numbers for the first time. Many broke down due to mechanical faults, but those that made it to the front lines often erupted into flames when struck by Soviet guns or Molotov cocktails hurled by infantry. Panther crews recalled the stench of burning fuel and the claustrophobic terror of trying to claw their way out of a wrecked turret while smoke filled their lungs. Even Germany's best aces weren't spared. Michael Wittmann, the legendary Tiger commander, met his end when his tank exploded under enemy fire in 1944. No amount of training, skill, or prestige could protect a crew once fire and ammunition met inside the armored shell. German engineers knew it too. They worked to improve crew survivability, but rushed production and material shortages meant compromises. Weld seams split, fuel systems leaked, and ammunition storage remained dangerously exposed. For the men inside, their vaunted panzers could turn into their graves in an instant. In truth, the Germans weren't so different from their enemies. Whether sitting inside a Sherman, a T-34, or a Tiger, tank crews across all nations shared the same grim reality. When armor failed, survival came down to seconds and luck. Despite the horrors, some tankers lived to tell the tale. Survival often came down to drills, quick thinking, and sheer comradeship. American Sherman crews, for example, practiced bailout procedures relentlessly. They memorized every escape route. The commander's hatch, the driver's hatch, even floor escape panels designed for emergencies. Seconds mattered, because once fire spread to ammunition racks, the tank could erupt like a bomb. British and Commonwealth crews developed their own coping tactics. Some fought with hatches cracked open in battle, despite the risk from snipers, just so they'd have a faster way out if flames erupted. Soviet tankers sometimes tied ropes to hatch handles so they could yank them open in a rush, even if their hands were burned or their strength failing. But survival wasn't just about escaping, it was about brotherhood. Veterans recalled moments when comrades risked everything to save one another, diving into burning tanks to drag out wounded friends. More than one crewman owed his life to a buddy who refused to leave him behind, even as flames roared and ammunition cooked off around them. Of course, not everyone walked away. Survivors carried scars, burns, missing limbs, and memories that haunted them for the rest of their lives. Many spoke of nightmares, waking in a sweat to the imagined smell of smoke or the boom of shells hitting steel. Others admitted the bond with their fellow crewmen ran deeper than family, because only those who sat inside a tank under fire could understand what it meant to live or die in that iron coffin. This was the paradox of tank life. For all its terror, many veterans still spoke of pride. They accepted the risks because they believed their machines, flawed as they were, gave them a fighting chance. And because inside that cramped, smoky space, they weren't just soldiers. They were brothers. By the end of World War II, one lesson was clear. Tanks were essential, but survivability needed to improve. The horrors of burning alive, of turrets blown sky high in jack-in-the-box explosions, left their mark on designers worldwide. Post-war tank engineering focused on one priority above all: keeping crews alive when armor failed. New ideas changed the game. Ammunition was moved into armored bins, sealed behind blast doors, or fitted with blowout panels designed to vent explosions away from the crew. Automatic fire suppression systems were installed to smother flames before they spread. Hatches were redesigned for faster escape, and engines were built to reduce fuel volatility. Modern tanks like the American M1 Abrams or the British Challenger reflect these hard-won lessons. In battle, Abrams crews have survived catastrophic hits thanks to compartmentalized ammo storage, something World War II tankers could only dream of. The goal became not just building powerful machines, but giving soldiers a chance to come home. And yet, the dangers never vanished. From Korea to the Gulf War to Ukraine, modern conflicts have shown tanks still explode, still burn, and still earn the old nicknames whispered by World War II crews, coffins on wheels. Now, the technology has advanced, but the fundamental truth remains. Climbing into a tank is one of the riskiest jobs in war. For the men of World War II, that truth defined their lives. They went into battle knowing every mission could be their last. Their courage, their sacrifice, and their willingness to fight inside those fiery iron beasts helped shape the war's outcome. The nickname Coffin on Wheels wasn't just dark humor, it was reality. And for generations of tankers since, it remains a reminder of the razor-thin line between protection and peril in the brutal world of armored warfare.